I titled today's talk, Afrofuturism's Implications on Musical Space-Time Travel, um, because of two reasons. One was that I think a lot about space-time travel lately in my work, spaces and times and the relationship between them and how we move from one to the other. And Afrofuturism, because it's part of my, I think, it's part of a methodology that my practice has. And Maarten pointed out to me that it might be particularly interesting in relation to today's research seminar. I thought it would really be helpful to frame a bit what I mean by Afrofuturism in my practice and in my approach, as well as in my thinking of that term and methodology. Uh, so Kojo Eshun notes that Afrofuturism can be characterized as a program for recovering the histories of counterfutures created in a century hostile to Afro-diasporic projection, and as a space within which the critical work of manufacturing tools capable of intervention within the current political dispensation may be undertaken. So for me, well, so the point is that on the one hand, Afrofuturism is a methodology that thinks in a very specific way about time. And I will unpack that a little bit more further right after. But it's also important, of course, that it is engaged in a practice of dealing with and working to unsettle racist systems, such, and with systems here, I mean the economic system, cultural systems, musical, social nation states, and so forth, to think through the coloniality that is still present and the racism and the other isms that are related to it, and to construct another way of thinking the present and the past and telling other kinds of stories. You know, for example, a lot of slaves would sign the name X, which means that you have sort of this absence, right, in history of certain figures and subjects, and this absence requires a specific way of dealing with history itself. And and this also is marked with a specific temporal sense about history, future, and present. It is not a approach to history that thinks about history as a progressive, you know, development of steps that lead to some end of history. But in that sense, Afrofuturism is really the only way to think futures, because it doesn't require an end of time as such. So something that's very fascinating to me about the temporal sense in this articulation of Afrofuturism, right, is how it's thinking about the possibility of futures, and through that possibility, thinking of possible futures, it's rethinking the present and the past. And that is a very specific relationship to time as well. So for this talk, I will speak a lot about space-time coupled. So to start with the first term of space-time, which is space, I attended this conference, had the pleasure of being part of this conference for CECIL Taylor, one of the founders, one of the early pioneers of new music. And actually, this is very interesting because Sonny Murray, the drummer that CECIL Taylor played with a lot, mentioned that they were using that term new music in the 60s. So since then, I feel that it's clear that there were some pioneers of new music. Well, anywho, he passed away in 2018, and there was this wonderful conference in 2019 at Brooklyn College about his work. And after, you know, a couple of days of phenomenal and stimulating research on Cecil Taylor and his work, there was this final concert. And during this final concert, I was sitting in the audience and digesting everything I've heard, you know, during the symposium. And I looked at my phone and I saw a message on social media that one of my friends, a collaborator, got banned from the US. And suddenly the idea of space and its relationship to music just struck me again. This kind of music that Cecil Taylor and others created, in my opinion, is a type of music that is a space creating music and a space traveling music. It's a music where you create a space through music to be yourself, you know, in a world um, where you might not be allowed to be in actually, right? Where your existence is something that should not be. This space of music allows then that is created together allows then for certain people who are denied to be themselves or to be in general to be and to be together and within this music in a space. That's the music. So as I mentioned, it's Cecil Taylor, but there's also other artists such as, for example, John Coltrane, the AACM, the Association for Advancement of Creative Musician, or the Sonora Orchestra. You can see a picture here, who are very much known for thinking about space and space travel in music. And of course, it is extra musical, if we want to say it like that. It didn't only involve sound making, but it involved also creating, you know, a business, venues, pedagogy, etc., etc. I just thought it might be useful to quickly play a short, very short excerpt of some of Cecil Taylor's large ensemble music, just to give you a sense in case you haven't really heard it before. As I said, just a very brief excerpt of his music. I'll just put in the chat what it was. Okay, so now it might be useful for us to talk about further about this space travel idea by first listening a bit of my piece to a bit of my piece, Space Travel from Home. I created this piece in the lockdown in New York, and it is a solo work for myself, which is actually taking the form of a TV series. And yeah, maybe you watch first. So I put a link in the chat, and if you could watch from 0 to 2 minutes approximately, and then we will reconvene here. Okay, so if everyone could come back to the presentation. So you saw in this piece, there's a lot of things to unpack, but I will focus only on this one aspect, which is the space-time travel. And what you saw is you saw this, you saw me, my instrument in my apartment, and then you saw this circle right behind me on the left side, which is a green screen. And the image that's in that green screen functions actually in two ways. So on one hand, it's kind of like a score. And on the other hand, it is kind of like a visual listening aid, listening support structure, if you will. So basically what's happening is that you see different kinds of celestial objects inside that green screen. So for example, you saw the outer space image, and then you saw a blue planet. Each celestial object has its own acoustic universe, and that is done by reverb. So if you, let's say you have that blue planet, planet A, it has a certain sound world, right? It has certain frequencies that resonate in it. It has a certain speed of decay of sound, and everything else that, you know, is part of the acoustic environment. So these are acoustic environments, virtual acoustic environments or spaces. Specifically in this piece, I created them using my percussion instruments, specifically the cymbals, the steel drum, which you see here, that's a steel drum, the kalimba, which is this that I played at the beginning of this excerpt that you just saw this here, and the Irish flute. And so I created a virtual acoustic environment for suns, for planets, and then of course you have different planets maybe, for outer space, and for the spaceship. And yeah, so okay. So let's say in the piece we have maybe 3 planets, as in this graphic here. If we have 3 planets and then also a spaceship, which is basically in this piece the listener, always the listener, and also me, the performer, then they are in a relationship to each other, right? The spaces on a fundamental level. So here I drew a graphic using 3 colors. I have a blue planet, a purple planet, and a orange planet. I decided that it wouldn't be so interesting to me if you enter into a space, the space just appears, and if you leave the space, it disappears. So I wasn't thinking of the piece like that. I was thinking of the piece more like you enter a space, you're visiting that space or the planet, and then you leave, but the planet still exists. That means it has a history and a future. And that, so yeah. And then the spaceship, which is the performer, has its own acoustic environment. But whenever it visits a planet, it of course enters that acoustic environment. Now, if the spaceship is visiting different planets with their own temporal timeline, their own temporal axis, their own space-time, then that makes the spaceship have a angle to the timelines of those spaces, which is indicated here in this angle, right? Because if you visit them in a certain speed, then you will, of course, you know, have a certain relationship to those timelines, which is marked here basically in that with that line, with those arrows here, and the dots are whenever you visit the space. Now, I wanted to think this further, and I was imagining, well, what happens if you have 2 travelers, 2 space travelers? Like, for example, this could be 2 musicians, or it could be 2 listeners. Each one of those can have their own speed. That means that, as you can see here in this graphic, that the angle changes depending on the speed, of course. And so you have a music where you have a space time and you visit it in different moments, and each musician or listener in different moments. And at some point they can meet each other and be in the same space. So the space is has a story, a history, a timeline, and a future, and the relationship between the spaces is created by the spaceship. Because for example, another aspect of it is that if you visit a space, you know, the space transforms by your visit. Um, for example, you know, like, or and you transform. So that's maybe easier to explain. It could be kind of like I was, for example, imagining timbre. We could imagine timbre. If you enter a space, you have to have a certain materiality to be in that space, right? Otherwise, you can't exist. If we use the analogy of planets again, that could be mean an atmosphere. If you use the analogy of human spaces, that could be a skin color, right? So there is this relationship between the space, the materiality, the individual, and time, and there's this, yeah, this multilateral relationship. So I created a piece where I did exactly this: multiple spaceships and multiple planets, spaces, right? So I created this piece called The Sound of Listening. So in this piece, you have here this map that I created, which is both score, part of the score, and also a reference for musicians, and also a sort of listening guide again. And you will see how exactly that works. But each one of these circles represents a virtual acoustic environment. It has a unique sound. So for example, this green one in the center, the sound world is generated using my right symbol, and that then I sculpted that reverb a bit further, and that means it has its own frequency response, its own timbre response, its own decay rate. And so does the yellow one, which is completely different because for the yellow one, I used my steel drum. So it has the characteristics of that timbre, and that sonic environment becomes then reflects then that timbre characteristic. And then of course I had to sculpt the decay as well. For this one, actually, I have a video that I need to share because it's not online. Where is it now? Oh, which really, I think, helps to further explain what I mean. So you basically will hear me talking and moving in the spaces. One can move as a musician in the spaces using a red dot. So if you look here, this is this square. This is actually where the map is. And then I have this red dot, which shows you where I am as I am speaking. Right, so that's that. So then you can move around in here, but you can also move completely different acoustic properties. And here you have sharply from the singular, and also you have sound, but here it's direct. So instead of moving like this into different rooms, you know, I can teleport myself to the different rooms. Bam, bing, bam. And then some rooms, like here we have some very interesting things. So as you heard, each room has its own unique sound world, and the musicians can travel in the space. And throughout the piece, there's different ways that they can do that. Like some sections of the piece have very um, completely written out scores where I even tell them where to move and of course what to play. Other sections have more system where I just say, okay, if you're in this room, you have this kind of material available, because of course then each room has its own story history, right? The history being what has been played or what has been possible to do in the room. That's the sort of the history, because as I mentioned, each room has its own frequency response and decay rate. That means if you play certain sounds or certain gestures, then that will not work maybe, or it will sound not very good, whereas other sound work great and sound good, etc., etc. Or there are certain affordances that each space has. Like if you have a resonance at 440, if you play the 440 really fast, just a quick grace note, and then you play something above it, you will of course have that grace note linger a little bit because it's a resonant sound. And we all know that intuitively when we enter into a room, right, we can hear the sounds that resonate, right? And then you can generate gestures around that. And so that creates a sort of language for each space. And then the musical piece becomes sort of the history or the story and the possible futures of that space. I added something else, namely I added environment sounds, what I call environment noises, which basically is like something like birds or water or a fire. I have one room that has whales. Of course, if you insert these environment sounds, there are two things that happen. One, the obvious one is that they're transformed by the room sound. They change their timbre characteristic, right? Another thing that happens is that temporality that continues even when you're not there is enhanced, of course, because you have other things making sound in the spaces, and that means the space becomes much more alive. As a listener, you also kind of navigate this map, and so I thought for the end of this presentation, it would be nice for you to just explore this virtual acoustic solar system on your own, instead of me telling you which excerpts to listen to. Maybe just skip around a bit because it's a piece that lasts for over an hour and a half. So you can maybe navigate it a bit quicker than you would usually, and you can also of course stop at some random place and experience the space. So I paste the link in the chat. Let me know if it's not working for you. There's also a purely video version of the piece. Actually, maybe I'd post that too, just in case some of you have get errors or something. So that's the video version. But I prefer if you look at the first link, the docs.google link. And maybe we can come back in about 3 minutes, Maarten? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so maybe we can return to the Zoom, and you can of course check this out later in your own time if you would like. Maybe one last thing I would like to say is that there were a couple of movements, and for example, the first movement is a solo work for a bass player, and the second movement is solo work for the oboe player. And then in the third movement, they suddenly meet. So that's kind of, right, like that graphic that I showed you before with the spaceships. So you have each one visiting similar spaces at times, and maybe even hearing remnants of each other. And then suddenly they meet, together in some space at some specific time. And that creates then that flourishing dual moment. Yeah, so with this, I'm at the end of this presentation, and I know I went through a lot of stuff, And if you have any questions about anything or thoughts, please feel free to email me. My email can be found on my website, and this is my website link. Maybe I should put it in the chat as well. And so, yeah, I think now we're gonna open it for questions.